Okay, Mary D.
Okay, how many people do we have? Just a few?
But that's all right.
A private audience. All right, we're counting on you guys to ask all the questions. So for the purposes, you guys both know Stuart, but for the purposes of the recording, it is my pleasure to introduce our teacher for the next 3 Covenant classes. As most of you know, Stuart Nixon has been a Covenant class member for many years and remains one of our favorite invited teachers for the class. By training and by profession, Stuart is a journalist with a BA in journalism from American University. However, as many of us know, he is a man of many interests and talents, which include, fortunately for us, scholarship, lecturing, and teaching. He has been not only a teacher and a writer, but also, among many other things, an editor, a genealogist, and the proprietor of a bookstore. When intrigued by a topic, Stuart does his own research and enjoys speaking to groups about his findings and perspectives on the topic. One such area of interest is biblical history and scholarship, which he tries to explain in terms suitable for a lay audience and tries to show how such material is relevant for people of Judeo-Christian heritage. And it just so happens that his topic for the next 3 classes is biblical scholarship, what it is and whether it's relevant to people of faith. We are very appreciative of Stuart's willingness to share some of his own scholarship on this topic, braving the daunting challenges of digital technology. Stuart, thank you so much for being with us tonight and the next couple of weeks with your thoughts about biblical scholarship. What is it, and is it relevant to people of faith?
I'm going to go ahead and share your screen.
Okay, well, good evening, and my gosh, everybody's been so gracious about this whole situation, so I can only say thank you. Yeah, biblical scholarship, what a topic. When I was working on this, I realized very quickly that maybe we should acknowledge right up front that when you start to use words like scholarship in a religious context, maybe not everybody's comfortable with that idea. I mean, after all, don't scholars kind of ask a lot of questions and debate a lot of theories and maybe use technical language? Is that really why we come to church for such things? So I'm mindful of the fact that this may or may not seem relevant, but that's the question I want to ask. First of all, what is biblical scholarship before we can decide whether it's meaningful? What is it? What's going on right now today in the field of biblical scholarship? And therefore, hopefully I will leave to you the question of, is it relevant to you personally? Because faith is a journey for each of us, of course. I've deliberately picked this picture to open up with because it's kind of a caricature of scholars. It's not all that serious. Are scholars really just sort of an eccentric group that's, in their own little world and they don't communicate to us very much or whatever? What is going on? Well, let's try and find out. I'm using a different computer, so I'm going to have to be careful which buttons I push. Oops. There we go. The subject, talking about scholarship, I think brings us face to face with the age-old question of faith versus reason. How do we approach our faith? And is it all a matter of faith, reading the Bible, or can we also be a little systematic about it, maybe a little rational about it? That's the question we deal with in many ways, and I think that's what we've got tonight. Where do we start? Well, I want to remind everybody, because we all need a reminder, that our Judeo-Christian heritage has always really been a product of questioning. It's never really been, I guess, what you'd call a happy process. There have been disputes all along the way, beginning very early. Here's an example of what I'm talking about. If you remember, the ministry of Jesus is dated to around 4 AD, around 30 AD. And in the early 300s, Constantine, the Roman emperor, finally legalized Christianity. Well, that's a long time between the ministry of Jesus and what we might call the institution of the church, 300 years. And even when Constantine calls the Council of Nicaea in an attempt to settle a lot of the unresolved issues among the congregations, it was only partially successful. In fact, and this was a little hard for me to believe, it took until 451 AD at the Council of Chalcedon for the faith that you and I practice today, the Christianity you and I understand, to really take the form of a consensus among all the church fathers. And even then, I've quoted here a scholar, Philip Jenkins, who teaches history and religious studies at Penn State. And even then, after Chalcedon, he points out that only the political victory of Chalcedon's supporters allowed that council's ideas to become the inevitable lens through which later generations interpret the Christian message. In other words, religion and politics became in conflict very early. And so we see these kind of issues way back. 450 years, over 400 years after the ministry of Jesus, and we're still trying to agree on the nature of Jesus and the nature of his ministry. So where do we start tonight? Well, I thought we'd try tonight starting with something we can agree upon, and that is we can all agree, Protestant and Catholic, conservative and liberal, denominational and non-denominational, we can all agree that the Bible is the Word of God. And what I have done here is attempt to take that idea, what I call the traditional understanding, and create a kind of template to break it down into its components. The traditional understanding said that God speaks to us through the Bible directly. It's literally God doing the talking. So the source is divine. There's no complication, there's no filter. God is doing the talking, which means that the process is dictation. God is speaking. And the result of that, the Bible, the written word, is a transcription of that dictation, which means the author is what we would normally call a secretary. I use an old-fashioned word here that I like, amanuensis, but it means that whoever is taking down the wording is trying to be absolutely faithful to the dictation, which means the content is free of errors because God is talking. It's errant, no error, no errors, no inconsistencies, no contradictions, nothing added, nothing subtracted. This is the word of God, exactly right. It is literally true. Now, that is a very powerful idea, this understanding of the Bible. And we can quickly figure out why that's the case, because for most of our history, as you know, populations were not able to read and write. So it was the priest doing the reading or somebody else in a position of leadership. So what we have here in terms of the authority of the text, is the text trustworthy? Well, yes, it is. And why is that? Because it is top down. God is speaking to the church leaders who in turn speak to the congregations. Now, in this context, by the way, we have to be careful. When we say somebody's illiterate in the medieval world, we're mainly talking about unable to read the intellectual language of the time, which was Latin. And you can see here, I pointed out that it took a long time for the church to come up with a Latin Bible. That was around 400 AD. You know that, it's called the Vulgate. As it happens, at the same time, roughly 400 AD, the Council of Carthage was debating which books belong in the New Testament. So at about the time we get a complete Latin Bible, we also get a complete New Testament. 400, about 400 years after the ministry of Jesus. A long time, a lot of history to try to comprehend. Now, there's another way of thinking about the Bible as the Word of God. And I call this the non-traditional understanding, the non-traditional way. And I'm using the same template to try to explain this. First of all, the source is human beings. These are people writing down what they believe God is saying, which is to say they are people inspired by the word, by God, as opposed to simply acting as copyists. So this text is now inspired text, but it's still a human product. Therefore, it's what scholars call literature. It follows the rules of literature, whatever those rules might be. And that means the author, of course, are writers and editors. It changes the game, though, as you can see. We now have a very different idea of content. We are no longer locked into the idea of inerrancy. Quite the opposite. We have human beings giving their versions of developments and events and people and ideas, etc. We're getting multiple viewpoints. We're getting debates. And we're also getting the influx of new information. Things change when new information comes up. So it's a very much what we could call an organic text. That in turn changes the authority of the Bible. We're now bottom up because people are starting to read the Bible for themselves, coming up with their own ideas, their own questions. It's not the Pope or the priest telling everybody how to interpret the Word of God. A very different situation. Now, how do we get to this second idea? Because the first, the traditional understanding of the Bible, has been so strong, so powerful, and so been with us so long. In fact, I think it's fair to say that to this very day, a majority of Christians still subscribe to the traditional understanding. That's the Bible for most folks. So we have here what is admittedly a minority view. So how did this come about? Well, there are a lot of ways we might explain this, but I've picked a way that kind of jumped out at me when I was doing my research. And my source in this case, what happened? My source in this case is a book you may very well know about because it's been selling extremely well, Sapiens, and it's written by a professor in, of all places, Jerusalem. It's an entirely, I would say, fresh approach to the history of human beings. He goes into all kinds of subjects: science, technology, economics, religion, et cetera, et cetera. I borrowed from him one of his, I guess you'd say, most important ideas. And that is, he said there's a time in human history, a moment in human history that he calls the discovery of ignorance. The discovery of ignorance. Now, what in the world is he talking about? He's saying here that for centuries, people depended on, let's call them myths, superstitions, rituals, all kinds of ways of trying to cope with the wider world, a world of chaos and mystery. But at some point, it occurs to people, or began to occur to people, that maybe we can do more than that. Maybe there's so much we don't know, but more importantly, maybe we can start to learn. We can replace the myths and the superstitions with knowledge. That was a big deal in terms of the book, The Sapiens. And so what it meant was that people wanted to learn. Now, I've picked an example of this. This is not Sapiens talking, this is Stuart talking, but I have picked here an example to try to convey how this happened. And that is the invention of paper. Paper was discovered, as you know, or invented, and I mean by this modern paper, what you and I call paper, was discovered in China or invented in China a long time ago. But the Chinese were very secretive about their technology. So it took a long time for that technology to leak to the Western world after the Crusades. So in about the 1100s, we find this ability to make paper showing up in Spain. It first shows up in Spain, and then it spreads to all of Europe. Why is this important? It's important because in the ancient world, making paper was a pain in the neck. It was complicated, it was labor intensive, and it was expensive. There were things like animal skins that had to be prepared and put together. In Egypt, there was papyrus, which was plant-based, all kinds of problems creating paper. And therefore, very few people needed to read and write because the technology just wasn't there. When modern paper came along, that turned everything upside down because the Chinese figured out two things: how to make paper very easily, and number two, how to make it cheap. Oh my goodness, the best of all worlds, easy to make and cheap. Suddenly you have a huge market you didn't have before, and that in turn makes people want to learn to read and write. Literacy rates jump. And you know, don't need me to tell you all of the implications of that. When literacy rates go up, people start to talk with each other, communicate with each other, and that means new ideas and new information are being transmitted. So we now have a very different idea about the world around us. The discovery of ignorance now is going to lead to the discovery of knowledge. And first, one good example of that, I've given that here for you. It sets the stage for the invention, the next big invention, and that's the printing press. The printing press, it's hard to overestimate this. This is just almost cataclysmic in what happens next. The example I've picked here, because you know about this, and it's a great example, is Martin Luther. I've picked another of my favorite books, From Dawn to Decadence, by another scholar. And here's what he says about Martin Luther. From his unexpected sabbatical in Wartburg Castle, Luther kept addressing the Germans on every issue of religious, moral, political, and social importance. Pamphlets, books, letters to individuals that were given to the press, biblical commentaries, sermons, and hymns kept streaming from Luther's inkwell. Oh, wow, don't you love it? Well, this statement is absolutely dead on. There's an entire book, I don't quote it here, but there's an entire book written explaining how Martin Luther worked with the printing press to disseminate his ideas. He was a master at it. You'd have to call him a master marketer or marketeer. You can read about that if you want. I can give you more information about that. But it conveys very beautifully the power of the press to turn the world upside down. And with it, of course, we got the Reformation. So what happens next? Okay. Well, you know what happens next. Here it is, the dawn of rethinking about everything. Gutenberg with the press, Christopher Columbus bumps into the New World, Copernicus. Probably if there's any example of turning the world upside down, it's Copernicus. And you'll notice he and Luther are right about the same time frame. So Copernicus's ideas about the universe are hitting Europe right about the time Luther is going to the church door to post his 95 Theses. Isn't that an interesting coincidence? Then we come to Galileo and Kepler. We're back to astronomy and cosmology. Again, the whole revolution in science, and that in turn brings to the stage Isaac Newton. Well, we could add other people here, but you get the point of all of this. An enormous amount of change is happening, and it's happening very fast. Hard for people to understand, hard to cope with, and yet you know the long-term implications. Okay, so this turns out to affect religion, of course. And here's where we first see, I'm going to say, the roots of scholarship as we understand scholarship. Most people, or a lot of people who read the Bible, were particularly interested in the first 5 books, what the Jews called the Torah or the Pentateuch, but generally the Torah is, you're most likely to see it as the Torah, the first 5 books. And tradition said that because Moses is featured so prominently in those books, he must have written them. And that became everybody's just assumption. It just seemed so natural. First 5 books, the Torah was written by Moses. But we see, interestingly enough, just a few little examples of where somebody is starting to question the Torah, the authorship of the Torah. I've given you a couple of examples here. Here's a Jewish physician in Spain around 1,000 years ago, in which he noticed that Moses could not have written all of the 5 books, because in Genesis, there's a list of Edomite kings, all of whom lived after Moses. So clearly Moses could not have put that material in there. Roughly the same time, a little later, a rabbi in Spain noticed that some of Torah is written in the 3rd person. And that seemed a little strange because people normally write about themselves and their experiences in the 1st person. An eyewitness doesn't usually talk about what happened in the 3rd person. So here you have, well, you might call these fairly minor questions, but you can start to see the very beginnings of curiosity about the authorship of the Bible and therefore the authority of it. This process now is going to continue. Doubts will continue. We're jumping now to the 1400s. We're still in Spain. That's a coincidence. We're still in Spain. I've just picked these examples. A priest, now this is a Catholic theologian this time, he noticed that at the end of Deuteronomy, which is the last of the 5 books, as you know, of the Torah, he noticed at the end of Deuteronomy, there is the obituary and a eulogy for Moses. Well, that seems a little odd if Moses wrote it, didn't write his own obituary. So how do we explain that? One answer was, well, Joshua came along and added the obituary and the eulogy to the Torah. But in Germany, right about the time of Luther, a fellow professor, in fact, with Luther, pointed out that if you look very carefully at the Hebrew in chapter 33 of Deuteronomy, and you look at the Hebrew of chapter 34, you've got the same writing style. Does not seem at all likely that Joshua in 34 could have imitated the style of the writer in 33. So it's not a scholarly argument that Joshua tacked on the obituary for Moses. Something else is going on here. And it apparently is not, Moses is not the author. So what happens next? New lines of inquiry. Now I've given you, we're covering a lot of history in a short time. We jumped to Britain in the 1600s. He's willing to say, the British philosopher Thomas Hobbes is willing to say, probably Moses wrote very little of the Torah. Spinoza, a very famous philosopher, as you know, in the Netherlands, decided that hardly any of Torah was written by Moses. And then something extremely important happens in France. A priest there says, Moses may have written certain parts, like certain legalistic materials, but it looks like a whole bunch of other people contributed to the Torah, inspired by the Holy Spirit. What we have here apparently is the multiple source theory for the authorship of the Torah, and of course, by extension, for the authorship of the Bible. But notice here the word inspired. We now have the idea of not dictation, but inspiration to explain the word of God. The multiple source theory, this theory now by the 1800s, something extremely important happens based on the multiple source theory, and it happens in Germany. A man named Julius Wellhausen, a professor of theology, takes the multiple source theory and develops it into a very, very sophisticated understanding of the Bible. He says Torah was written by 4 sources that he feels are clear enough to identify, not necessarily by the exact name of the person who wrote them, but by the person or persons who wrote each section. And he calls these different components J, E, D, and P. This is called, this idea, Wellhausen's idea, becomes known as the documentary hypothesis. This is foundational scholarly thinking today about the Bible. Now, I'm not going to go spend a lot of time on this. It's complicated. We've talked about this before in covenant class. J, very quickly, is distinctive because the writer, whoever he was, only calls God by a name, the name Yahweh. Now, remember, in Hebrew, vowels are not written. So in English translation, or actually in other languages as well, we have to put the vowels back in. He put the vowels back in, but in German, he put them in German. So in German, J and Y are the same thing. So that's why he spelled it Jahwe, and that gets translated for our purposes as Yahweh, Yahwh. Okay, God is only known in the J source as Yahweh. E does not do that. E starts out calling God not by a name, but by a generic term known as Elohim or El. Often you'll just see El. If you do some of the reading that I've been doing, you'll see El instead of Elohim. Either way, we have to be careful here. That is not a name. That is not a proper noun. I put a capital letter on this just to be a little more consistent. But what E does, the E writer, he calls God, refers to God as a God, an Elohim, until Moses shows up. Once Moses shows up, then God gets a name. Why is that? Because God tells Moses what his name is. Remember, Moses asked God for a name, and God gives him that name, and that name is Yahweh. So E is very different in telling the story. D is what is found, the material found in Deuteronomy. Very distinctive. We're not going to take a lot of time tonight on D. And finally, P, clearly written by priests. Clearly written by priests. And again, that's as complicated as Deuteronomy. I don't want to get off on a tangent here. J and E are going to be the earliest sources for the Torah. D and P are going to be later sources, just to give you a quick idea. Now, I'm quoting a scholar here, Richard Friedman, one of the major scholars today, in his wonderful little guidebook called Who Wrote the Bible. Here's what he has to say about the documentary hypothesis. It has dominated the field of biblical study ever since Wellhausen formulated it. To this day, if you want to disagree, you disagree with Wellhausen. If you want to pose a new model for the Torah, you compare its merits with those of Wellhausen's model. I think it's fair to say this is the consensus of modern biblical scholarship. Now, let me give an example of how to apply the documentary hypothesis, because it's easy to talk in the abstract. It's more helpful when we get down to specifics. This will help you understand why the non-traditional understanding of the Bible has become the basis on which most modern biblical scholarship is conducted. And I use that phrase very carefully, modern biblical scholarship. That's the term you will hear the most often. We're quoting from Genesis. Now note carefully where we're getting this. Genesis chapter 7, the first 2 verses. Then the Lord said to Noah, take with you 7 pairs of all clean animals and a pair of the animals not clean. Genesis 7, first two verses. That's a total of 8 pairs of animals, 7 clean and 1 pair unclean. Now, skip just a few verses, chapter 7, 8 and 9, verses 8 and 9. Here's what it says: of clean animals and animals not clean, 2 and 2 went into the ark with Noah as God had commanded. Wait a minute. 2 and 2 means there are 2 pairs, 4 animals, not 7 pairs. So we have a very different situation. How do we reconcile this? Here's what we do. The scholars have noted that if you look closely at this, the story later says that in the first passage, that Noah erected an altar where he sacrificed clean animals. That is only possible if he had more than 1 pair of clean animals on the boat, because he needed the other clean animals to mate, to reproduce. So that's a strong argument for the first passage. The second passage refers to the name Yahweh, which, by the way, in English is usually translated Lord. The first passage refers to God by his name, whereas the second passage, citing only 2 pairs of animals, refers to God as a God. In other words, as Elohim. So we have 2 distinct versions of this one story in the same chapter of the Torah. Now, you might say, well, okay, but this is maybe making too much out of nothing. How many animals were on the ark? The problem is that the documentary hypothesis takes us to all kinds of inconsistencies that are buried in the text. Every time the hypothesis seems to hold up. For example, and again, I'm quoting here from Freeman, the P source written by priests, consecrated priests are the only intermediaries in the P source between humans and God. In the P versions of the stories, there are no angels, there are no talking animals, there are no dreams. Even the word prophet does not occur in P except once. There are no blatant anthropomorphisms. In J and E, God walks in the Garden of Eden. God personally makes Adam's and Eve's clothes. He personally closes Noah's ark. He smells Noah's sacrifices. He wrestles with Jacob's. He speaks to Moses out of the burning bush. None of these things are in P. So once we have identified the 4 sources, we find we actually have 4 different versions in the Torah of the Judeo-Christian birth story, I guess you'd say, the birth narrative, as it were. So you can kind of pick up on the implications here of what's going on. Now, when we talk like this in terms of scholarship, the name for this approach to the Bible has come to be called textual criticism. Textual criticism. What can we learn from the language, from the wording, the way it's worded, the choice of words, et cetera, et cetera. We can ask all kinds of questions. I've got to admit that scholars have chosen a term here which is very easily misunderstood for those of us in the pews, for most Christians. Textual criticism. You and I use criticism in a very specific way. Scholars do not use it that way. The word criticism here means analysis. It is a neutral term. That's hard to understand. I agree with you. It's hard to think of it as a neutral term, but that's what they mean here. All they want to know is who wrote the Bible, for whom was it written, who was the audience. That's a very important point. When was it written? Where was it written? What did the writer mean? Do we really know what the Hebrew meant, or the Aramaic, or whatever the language was? How sure are we of a language that old? And finally, maybe what's the biggest question of all for you and me, what about the translations? There are so many translations. I'm sure that Wilson or Amy or Earl, Rohr, we have all kinds of good folks here at the church who could explain the many problems with translation. So textual criticism has become a mainstay in the world of modern biblical scholarship. But that's not all. It's based, as I've pointed out, textual criticism is based on inspiration, not on dictation. Now, what's next? Well, you can imagine that this is not going to win a lot of fans in the institution of the church. And I've given you one example here, a man named Charles Briggs. He studied to be, back in the 1800s, when textual criticism was gaining so much importance, thanks to Wellhausen. He studied to be a Presbyterian minister. You can see here that in 1866, he was a Presbyterian, licensed to be a Presbyterian minister, but he chose to go to Europe to continue his studies. And there he bumped into, understandably, the German scholars who were supporters of textual criticism. So when he came back to America and took a job at his alma mater as a professor, everything was fine until he gave a speech, 1891, where he said textual criticism makes sense. Well, no, not to his fellow Presbyterians. And you can see it took only 2 years for them to get rid of him. He was convicted of heresy in 1893. I'm not going to linger on this. There was a lot of ill will, but this was a huge case at the time in our Presbyterian history. It's also the time that we see the 1800s. It's also the time we see archaeology taking on the sophistication that we know today. It all I shouldn't say it all begins, but certainly one of the big events was the discovery of the Rosetta Stone in 1799. It took British and French scholars over 20 years, and were not until almost the mid-1800s before they figured out what the writing was on the stone. It was covered with writing, and you can read all about it if you're not familiar with it. It was a landmark event. It just helped scholars so much understand ancient language, including Egyptian hieroglyphs. Another interesting development was the discovery of Pompeii and the interest of people going in there and excavating the ruins of the city. That began as early as 1738, but the problem was the people doing it were amateurs. They really didn't know what they were doing, and they messed things up. When we fast forward to the mid-1800s, all of that changes. The excavators at Pompeii had learned a lot of lessons, and this time they did things carefully, and you and I are the beneficiaries today because you know it's one of the great historical archaeological sites anywhere in Pompeii, Italy. So archaeology is starting in the 1800s to become much more a science. And it doesn't stop here. In the mid-1800s, there was a discovery in what was once Assyria, Mesopotamia, you know Mesopotamia, modern day Iraq, discovery of 12 cuneiform tablets covered with writing. And to everybody's shock, when you looked at it carefully, it was a poem, a very long poem. We call it the Epic of Gilgamesh. Embedded in this poem is the story about a huge flood in the Middle East. And the attributes or the details of the story are so close to those of the biblical flood account. Scholars today say it could not have been a coincidence. It is just not possible that the early Jewish people or the early Hebrew people really invented this story on their own, not invented, but told the story of their own unique flood. Quite the opposite. Apparently, neighboring cultures borrowed from each other to tell the story of certain events that affected all of them. And the biblical account seems to be a very good example of this. The Epic of Gilgamesh was a major discovery when it comes to reading the Bible. And we keep going. End of the 1800s, a British archaeologist, a real pioneer in the field, found what's called the Moneptha Steely. A stele is a monument, usually a stone monument, not always. Moneptha was an Egyptian pharaoh. This particular stele he erected or had erected for him is about 10 feet tall. It's covered, just covered like the Rosetta Stone with wording. And what was so amazing to the scholarly community was that in bragging about all the people he claimed he defeated, Moneptha says there was this little group known as Israel. Oh my goodness, Israel. It's the first time there's evidence of a group of people with the identity of Israel. Now we have to be careful. This is an identification. It is an ethnic identification. It is not a geographical reference. This is not a reference to a place. It's a reference to a people who believe themselves to be distinctive from their neighbors, and they call themselves Israel. Huge discovery, the Moneptha Steely. And it took a long time to figure it all out. But you can see we're late into the 1800s and really moving to the 1900s. This is the big event of the beginning of the 1900s. You know Albert Schweitzer. He was not only the son of a Lutheran pastor, but he himself studied and became ordained in his own right. He also became very interested in what's known as the historical Jesus, which is the human side of Jesus. We confess him both ways, as you know, divine and human. Schweitzer became interested in the human side. In other words, what was his life like in first century AD, first century Roman Empire, first century Near East as a Jew? And he particularly was interested in whether there's anything we can find out about Jesus that's not in the Bible. This method is known as the historical critical method. In other words, you're trying to pull from any source you can and relate those sources. He published his first work, I believe, he was from Alsace. I think he published in German, I can't remember. In any case, it was not until 1910 when the book was published in English. Ever since that happened, it has become a mainstay of of biblical scholarship. To this day, you can get it. Because he really broke new ground here, asking this question. The book is named The Quest of the Historical Jesus. The next event in the 20th century is what's called known as the Mag Hammadi Library. Again, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this. It was discovered in Egypt. Talk about a chance discovery. Two peasants lifted a rock, for goodness sakes, and found these codices. Codices are written manuscripts that are connected, physically attached to each other, but not like the modern book. We can't really call them books, but they were sort of a semi-book. I don't know if you want to say it that way. What was so interesting was this was Christian writing, but it included all kinds of gospels that had been more or less known about to scholars, but nobody quite knew what was in them. And they certainly were not in our Bible. Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Philip, a whole bunch of new material. Big discovery, and we're still discussing this today. Early scholars are still discussing this today. You can see I pointed out to you here that it took until the 1970s, for goodness sakes, to figure out exactly what the language was and what it was saying. One more big discovery, and you know what it is. 1947, the Dead Sea Scrolls. You can't hardly overestimate this archaeologically or in terms of how scholars have reacted. Just enormous, huge library of material. Nobody knew it was there. It had been in these caves for 2,000 years. Seemingly impossible. And yet there it was. And you and I have talked about this at great length. So now I think you get the point. What I'm trying to do is build this for you, how we went from one period to another. We passed the discovery of ignorance, and an awful lot of water has passed onto the bridge since that time. What I want to do in the next two sessions is let the scholars speak for themselves. I'm going to just pick samples of lectures and let you hear them, see these people. They're all very different, some Jewish, some Christian, some other denominations or other faith traditions, and just let you decide for yourself what it's like, or at least see for yourself what it's like to hear these people talk, because they speak their own language to a certain extent. And we'll try it together on Sunday. So thanks again for your patience of this week. And I'm very grateful for this opportunity.
Stuart, thank you so much. That was fascinating as always. Thanks to you, and thanks to everybody who joined us tonight for the live Zoom of Stuart Nixon's first lecture. We will all be back together again on Zoom on Sunday, May the 9th for Stuart's second class. And until then, many thanks to Stuart, and everybody have a good week.
Thanks.